I can still remember that night, the cold, silk-like touch against my wrist. But it wasn't silk. It wasn't velvet. It was hair. A bracelet delicately woven from the silver strands of my late mother's hair. That night, rain poured mercilessly over London. The cobbled streets gleamed under the faint glow of flickering gas lamps' puddles, reflecting light like shattered pieces of a dying star. I, barely 20 then, stood under the eaves of Mallory's Curiosity and Fine Craft, the workshop of a man both famed and feared. They said Henry Mallory didn't just craft jewelry, he captured memories, and perhaps something more, something not quite of this world. Through the fogged window pane, I could see the soft flicker of the furnace fire. Above it, hundreds of delicate strands of hair swayed, gently hung across fine wooden racks. To the untrained eye, they looked like cobwebs caught in the glow. But to me, they seemed alive, like tiny, restless spirits dancing in the warm air. In my trembling hands was my mother's final letter, her last words scrawled in fading ink. Along with it, wrapped in ivory silk, was a small lock of her silver-white hair. If you cannot hold me in your heart forever, then hold me here, where your hands may feel and your heart may remember. That's what she had written. And so, in the bitter chill of a December night, I stood there clutching what remained of her, ready to fulfill her final wish. The heavy oak door creaked mournfully as I pushed it open. Heat from the roaring furnace rushed toward me, carrying with it a strange blend of scents, molten silver beeswax, and something faintly metallic, almost like the scent of dried blood and old sorrow. There he was, Henry Mallory, seated at his low, battered workbench, surrounded by tools I couldn't name, needles finer than a hair's width, a loom no larger than my palm, and dozens of glass jars filled with hair, blonde brunette, jet black and pale as moonlight. Without looking up, he spoke in a voice roughened by years and smoke. "You've brought it then." I stepped forward, my hand trembling, as I placed the silk bundle before him. He paused, and then, without warning, his deep-set eyes lifted to mine, sharp, penetrating, as though he could see straight through me. "Was it painful?" he asked softly. His voice didn't judge, didn't pity, just understood. My throat tightened. I couldn't speak. And in that moment I realized this old man had crafted hundreds of these strange mementos. Each strand of hair he touched had been woven with grief, loss, and love. "I'll make it into a bracelet," he said at last. "Thin and light, something you can wear every day, and no one will ever guess that it carries death upon it." He leaned back in his chair, a sad smile pulling at his cracked lips. In the glow of the fire, his wrinkled face looked like a map of forgotten sorrows, every line a story untold. I stayed in London for the next 3 days. Each afternoon, as the great bells of Big Ben tolled through the fog, I found myself wandering back to that narrow street, standing just beyond the workshop's window, watching. Inside, under the dim golden light, Mallory worked like a man possessed. He cleaned each strand of hair with a liquid from a dark bottle, its label faded beyond recognition. He dried them gently over perfumed smoke, and then, with impossibly steady hands, began to weave them into patterns upon that tiny loom. It was as if he were weaving not just threads of hair, but fragments of memory itself. And then the day came. Mallory pressed the finished bracelet into my palm, a thing so delicate it barely weighed anything at all. Silver strands glimmered faintly in the firelight, braided into a perfect circle. At the center sat a single tiny pearl, a symbol of peace. He muttered, his voice soft as the sigh of a closing door. "Put it on," he said, "and listen." I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist. The hair so smooth and fine, it felt almost like warm silk against my skin. And then, something impossible happened. In the stillness of that room, above the crackle of the hearth, beyond the sound of rain whispering against the window panes, I heard it. A voice, familiar, gentle, my mother's voice, calling my name. They say every tradition has a beginning, but not all beginnings are bathed in light. Some are forged in grief, bound by fear, and steeped in the quiet desperation of those left behind. Long before the glittering salons of Victorian England, before mourning jewelry became a fashionable statement among the upper class, there were the old ways, ancient, hidden, and dark. It began not with beauty, but with fear. Fear of death, and of what came after. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where life was short and the afterlife uncertain, people clung to anything that might grant them a measure of control over death's cold grip. And what better to hold on to than a piece of the departed themselves? A lock of hair became more than a keepsake. It was believed to be a vessel, a bridge between the living and the dead. Hair, unlike flesh and bone, does not decay easily. It endures, and so in hushed whispers, it was said that to keep a strand of hair from a loved one was to hold a fragment of their very soul, a token against the creeping void of forgetfulness. In the small, wind-battered villages of the north, grieving mothers braided the hair of their lost children into tiny charms worn close to the heart. Soldiers carried locks of their beloved's hair into battle, believing it would guard them against death. But not all such practices were innocent. There are records hidden deep in the Vatican archives and the dusty shelves of forgotten libraries that tell of a far more disturbing use for these remnants. In the 14th century, during the height of the Black Plague, entire communities were swallowed by fear and superstition. Amidst the endless death whispers grew of spirit, binding a dark art practiced by those desperate to hold onto the souls of the dead. Spirit binders, as they came to be known, believed that if you possessed a part of someone, most commonly their hair, you could control their spirit, even after death. For some, it was an act of love to ensure their beloved would watch over them forever. For others, it was a means of revenge. One of the most infamous cases was that of Lady Isolde Grey-More, a noblewoman accused of commissioning a craftsman to create elaborate necklaces using the hair of her late husband and his murdered mistress. It was said she wore the necklace day and night, a grim token of her triumph. Those close to her spoke of strange happenings, the faint scent of rosewater lingering in cold halls, and the sound of hushed weeping in empty chambers. Lady Grey-More herself claimed she felt the warmth of their betrayal fade with every passing night as she fingered the delicate braids resting against her throat. No one dared confront her directly. But after her death, her jewelry was found locked away in a hidden drawer, its silver tarnished black, the once golden strands of hair within turned brittle and gray. To this day, that collection remains sealed in the vaults beneath the British Museum, too steeped in legend and perhaps something darker to be displayed. By the time the Renaissance swept across Europe, Death had become a spectacle in its own right. Funerals were grand, dramatic affairs. Grief became a performance, and with it, the mementos of that grief grew more ornate. Artisans in Florence and Paris began to specialize in crafting intricate mourning pieces from human hair rings, brooches, lockets, each containing carefully woven designs. Hair was not merely kept in hidden lock boxes, it became fashion. But even as the art grew more refined, its roots remained tangled in the macabre. Behind every delicate curl and woven pattern lay an unspoken question. Was this an innocent remembrance, or something more sinister? It was in this era that the famous French artisan Etienne Marchand rose to notoriety. His creations were prized by queens and courtesans alike, known for their haunting beauty. But Marchand had secrets whispers followed him through the winding streets of Paris. It was said he obtained his finest materials not from grieving families, but from far darker sources. One account tells of how Marchand would frequent the city morgues at night, paying off attendance for locks of hair taken from the recently deceased, those who had died alone with no family to claim their body. Another rumor spoke of a hidden chamber beneath his workshop, where not all the hair he worked with had been willingly given. Though nothing was ever proven, his sudden disappearance during the tumultuous days of the French Revolution remains one of the city's many unsolved mysteries. His workshop was found abandoned, a half-finished locket left on the table, its design incomplete, but unmistakably woven from human hair. And so, as the centuries turned, this dark tradition evolved. From fear to fashion, from grief to power, from love to control. But one truth remained through it all: hair endures. Long after the heart stops beating and the voice fades to silence, hair remains, a final, unyielding testament to the life that once was, and perhaps in the wrong hands, a chain that binds the dead to the living far longer than they should remain. In the faint candlelight of a mourning chamber, a widow fingers the soft braid wrapped around her wrist. A child clutches a locket close to their heart, a silent promise to a mother lost too soon. And somewhere in the forgotten corners of history, the whispers of those bound by these delicate chains still linger, waiting to be heard. Grief had always been a private sorrow, until the day it walked boldly into the grand halls of Europe, dressed in black silk and adorned with jewelry spun from the very essence of the dead. It no longer whispered in shadowed corners, it demanded to be seen. It began with a queen. Queen Victoria, the longest reigning monarch of her time, was not just a sovereign, she was a tastemaker, a cultural force. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, passed away in 1861, the fabric of British society itself seemed to tear. The Queen did not mourn quietly. For the remaining 40 years of her life, she wore black every single day. Her sorrow became a public display, a royal commandment that reshaped the very concept of grief. Mourning was no longer a fleeting period of sadness. It became a lifestyle, an aesthetic, a fashion statement. And with it came the rise of an industry that thrived on death-mourning jewelry. But these were not simple trinkets. They were intricate, masterfully crafted pieces, often centered around a deeply personal and profoundly morbid element: human hair. It was said that Queen Victoria herself wore a locket containing a lock of Prince Albert's hair against her heart until the day she died. As word of her devotion spread, the British aristocracy scrambled to emulate her. Suddenly, wearing mourning jewelry wasn't just a private act of remembrance, it was a social expectation. Funeral rites transformed. Mourning periods were regulated and precise. First, mourning, a full year of deep grief, marked by plain black garments and minimal social interaction. Second, mourning. 6 months of black, but with the introduction of modest jewelry, often made from the hair of the deceased. Half-mourning lighter shades of gray and lavender entered the wardrobe, but the jewelry remained a lingering reminder of the loss endured. And what better way to display one's grief and social refinement than with a brooch of delicately woven hair set behind black onyx, or a ring with a miniature portrait framed by the soft curls of a departed child. Behind closed doors, entire mourning salons emerged. These were not places of comfort, but of commerce. In the heart of London, Paris, and Vienna, master jewelers set up exclusive workshops advertising their ability to transform the remnants of the dead into wearable art. Bracelets crafted from plaited hair, often interwoven with jet beads, or pearls symbolizing tears. Lockets containing not just photographs, but tiny woven floral patterns made entirely of hair. Rings etched with initials and dates of death, bordered by a delicate frame of braided strands. The more elaborate the piece, the deeper the sentiment, or at least the greater the wealth required to afford it. Yet beneath the glittering surface of this new fashion, darker currents swirled. The demand for mourning jewelry exploded, and with it, the quiet desperation of families who had no such keepsakes to hold on to. For the poor, the cost of having a single mourning ring made was more than a month's wages. And so, in the alleys of London's East End and the winding streets of Montmartre, a black market arose. Strangers offered hair of unknown origin for grieving families too destitute to have saved a lock before the burial. Others sold stolen hair from fresh graves, or worse, procured it through means better left unspoken. It was not uncommon for jewelers to receive small bundles wrapped carefully in silk. No note attached, the origin a mystery. Some accepted without question. Others asked a price higher than coin. One chilling case was recorded in Vienna, 1874. A noble family, desperate to preserve the memory of their lost daughter, commissioned a renowned artisan to craft a mourning necklace. But when the final piece was delivered, the mother, upon inspection, recognized a single unmistakable strand of dark auburn hair among the pale golden threads of her child's remains. Her daughter's hair had been nearly white blonde. That one strand did not belong. The scandal was quietly buried, just like the origins of that foreign hair. But the question lingered, whose sorrow did she truly wear around her neck? And so death became fashion. Mourning was no longer an act of healing. It became a performance. The more extravagant the mourning jewelry, the more public the grief. It was a way to declare to society, look at the depth of my sorrow. See how dearly I have loved and lost. Fashion houses began releasing entire mourning collections, pairing somber black dresses with matching hair jewelry sets. Jet stones, black enamel, and somber pearls became as coveted as diamonds. Even young women began preparing their own hair to be woven into jewelry after their passing a morbid addition to a dowry chest. In some circles, It was believed to be a final graceful gift to those left behind. But as the 19th century drew to a close, the tides began to shift. The Industrial Revolution brought with it a new pace of life, a focus on the future rather than the past. Medicine advanced. Death no longer loomed quite so heavily over every household. Mourning jewelry, once a symbol of devotion, began to feel outdated, a relic of a darker, more superstitious time. And yet even as fashions changed, and the old mourning salons shuttered their doors, the pieces remained locked in velvet-lined boxes hidden away in attic trunks, or displayed in glass cases at museums, their delicate braids still intact, their silent whispers still lingering in the quiet moments between night and dawn. In the end, fashion moved on, but death always finds a way to linger in the folds of fabric, in the hollow spaces between pearls, in the soft, almost forgotten touch of hair against skin. And for those who wore these morbid treasures, perhaps somewhere deep in their hearts they wondered, was it really just jewelry, or had they bound something far more eternal around their necks? They called him the Weaver of Sorrows. But no sign hung above his door, no advertisements proclaimed his mastery. And yet, his creations adorned the most delicate wrists and fragile hearts of Parisian high society, crafted not from silk or gold, but from the final remnants of the departed. It was said that if you wandered far enough through the labyrinth of Rue des Ombres, the Street of Shadows, you might stumble upon the small weathered door. Faded and cracked its iron handle cold even in the summer months. Few spoke openly of the place, and fewer still admitted to having entered. But for those drowning in grief, and with the coin to pay for a memory, made eternal, this hidden corner of Paris held the promise of something lasting, something immortal. The man who worked behind that door was known simply as Lucien Virot. By day, he was a quiet presence at the city's most discreet funerals, his eyes always scanning the faces of mourners, his gloved hands always folded behind his back. By night, he vanished into the narrow alleys of Montmartre, slipping into his hidden workshop beneath the old wine cellars of a long-abandoned chateau. It was said Lucien could weave sorrow into beauty, transform grief into something tangible, wearable, unforgettable. Inside his workshop, the air was heavy with the scent of aged cedarwood, burning myrrh, and something faintly metallic. Delicate wooden racks lined the walls, each draped with hair of every imaginable shade, brilliant golds, raven blacks, and soft, ghostly silvers. Some strands shimmered like moonlight. Others seemed to absorb the shadows themselves. He worked in silence, save for the occasional crackle of the hearth, or the faint drip of water from the stone ceiling above. His tools were ancient, passed down through generations of artisans who had long since slipped from the pages of history. Miniature looms no larger than a child's palm. Silver needles so fine they bent like reeds in the wind. Bottles of secret solutions, purifying agents, or perhaps something more arcane that cleansed and preserved the fragile strands. No one knew exactly where Lucien learned his craft. Some whispered of a hidden guild of mourning artisans lost to time. Others spoke of a dark apprenticeship under a disgraced monk who had once served at the Vatican's hidden library. But those were only rumors, weren't they? Lucien's creations were unlike any other. Each piece carried within it a secret language, patterns and braids that spoke silent volumes to those who knew how to read them. A simple three-strand braid symbolized eternal remembrance. A spiral weave meant unresolved grief, a love that ended before its time, a knot without an end. Well, that was something else entirely. Some claimed it was a binding, a way to tether a soul to the living world, never fully letting go. And the most sought after of all, the lament Rings, said to be crafted entirely of human hair without a single thread of metal or stone. Worn tight upon the finger, they were believed to bring the presence of the deceased closer, sometimes too close. One rainy winter's night, a carriage drawn by black horses stopped before the hidden door. Its curtains were drawn tight, but those who caught a glimpse swore the visitor was a duchess, her face veiled in deepest mourning. She carried with her a small velvet pouch containing the pale blonde hair of a lost child, her only son taken by a sudden fever. She didn't want a simple locket, nor a brooch to pin behind her veil. She wanted something permanent. For 3 nights Lucian worked by candlelight, his hands never trembling despite the cold that seeped through the stone walls. The result was a bracelet so delicate it seemed spun from light itself. A pale gold circle no wider than a finger's breadth, held together by nothing but the intricacy of its weave. When the Duchess slipped it onto her wrist, witnesses claimed she gasped softly and smiled, for the first time since her loss. But some say that smile soon faded. She was later seen wandering the gardens of her estate long after midnight, whispering to the darkness, as though speaking to a child no one else could see. Not all of Lucian's commissions were acts of love. Some were born of vengeance. A wealthy merchant once requested a pendant crafted from the hair of his deceased business partner, a man he believed had betrayed him in life. The merchant wore that pendant over his heart every day until his own death. And when his estate was settled, his journals revealed chilling entries. He had begun hearing whispers in the dead of night, the familiar voice of his former partner cursing his name, and yet despite this, he refused to remove the pendant, as if he couldn't bear to part with his hatred even in death. Lucien Viraud never turned away a client, whether it was love or hatred, devotion or regret. He believed all emotions deserved to be honored and bound in the delicate strands of the departed. Some say he worked until the very night he died. His final creation left unfinished on his work table a ring woven not from the hair of another, but from his own. The ring was never found. Some believe it still exists, hidden somewhere in the catacombs beneath Paris, waiting for a hand bold or foolish enough to wear it. And so deep beneath the city of light, amidst the echoes of forgotten footsteps and lost prayers, the faint scent of burning myrrh still lingers. The weaver of sorrows may be gone, but his work, his whispers, remain. They say that every braid tells a story, but in the hands of a master, a braid could become a confession, a declaration of forbidden love, or a curse whispered in silk threads hidden from all but those who knew how to look. In the age of mourning, jewelry hair was more than a memento. It became a secret language. To the untrained eye, a delicate bracelet or intricately woven brooch seemed merely a work of art, a tasteful nod to loss. But for those who understood the ancient codes hidden in the twists and patterns, these pieces spoke volumes. Each knot, each coil, and each delicate loop held meaning, and in some cases, dangerous secrets. The language of the weave. It began innocently enough. In the early 1800s, European artisans developed a subtle visual language through hair weaving. At first, it was used to express emotions that propriety forbade. A three-strand braid symbolized a simple remembrance, a token of love or friendship lost to time. A tight spiral coiled inward represented grief that consumed the heart, a life cut short before its time. But then the language grew darker. A 7-loop knot was believed to bind a promise from beyond the grave. If given to a grieving widow, it was a silent oath: you will never love again. A broken weave where a pattern abruptly ended and resumed at a different angle represented betrayal, the severing of trust. And the most feared of all patterns was the endless coil, a continuous, intricate loop with no beginning and no end. It wasn't worn as a mourning symbol, but as a talisman or a warning. Those who wore the endless coil were believed to have made a pact to either keep a soul bound close or to ensure that the dead never found peace. The merchant's curse. One infamous example of this hidden language appeared in the court records of London in 1871. A wealthy spice merchant named Bartholomew Crane was found dead in his study. His heart failed at just 45 years of age. At first glance, it seemed a simple tragedy, but when his effects were inventoried, investigators found a peculiar object, a silver locket, its surface unadorned, except for a single faint engraving inside "She Knows." Inside the locket was a tight coil of pale blonde hair, bound in the endless coil pattern. It was later revealed that Crane had been engaged in a long-standing affair with a young woman named Eliza Hartley, who had mysteriously vanished just months before his death. No body was ever recovered, but some whispered that the locket was not merely a token of memory, but a final silent accusation, woven strand by strand with the hair of the woman he had wronged. They say that even in death she refused to let him go. The lover's knot that should have never been untied. In Paris, another story circulated among the dying embers of the Belle Époque. A young countess, Madeleine Fournier, had been engaged to marry a wealthy industrialist, twice her age. But her heart belonged to a penniless poet named Luc Danton. The affair was brief, fiery, and doomed. When Luc took his own life, some say by drowning in the Seine, others whisper of a duel gone horribly wrong, Madeleine descended into mourning far beyond what society dictated. She commissioned a necklace made from Luc's hair, its design bold and unmistakable, a lover's knot at the center, a symbol of passion bound forever. But against the advice of her family and the quiet warnings of her priest, she refused to remove it. In the months that followed, servants claimed to hear her conversing softly in her chambers late at night. Some said they saw her reflected in mirrors alone, yet speaking to a figure no one else could see. Her health faded, her mind frayed, and one night she vanished from her bedchambers, never to be seen again. The only thing left behind was the necklace perfectly arranged on her pillow, and it is said the knot had come undone. Secrets passed through generations. Not all secrets hidden in mourning jewelry were tied to love and tragedy. Some held knowledge passed quietly through generations. Among certain noble families, it became tradition to encode vital family information, inheritance rights, hidden wealth, or the location of forgotten estates into the braids and knots of their mourning pieces. To outsiders, the jewelry was nothing more than an elaborate sign of grief. But to those within the bloodline, the patterns spoke clearly. A series of tight vertical loops represented the number of generations to which a title belonged. Knots at precise intervals marked the geographic coordinates of hidden family properties. A twist inverted at the center signaled the location of hidden wealth or valuables. In some cases, this knowledge was lost when heirs died without passing the key to interpret the patterns. Treasures, perhaps even entire fortunes, may still lie hidden their locations, locked within the silent weaves of jewelry, forgotten in dusty attics and museum vaults. The ultimate binding. And then there was the most whispered of secret. The belief that certain patterns, when woven precisely by a master, could truly bind the soul of the dead. It was a dangerous art, one said to be practiced only by the most skilled and reckless artisans, men like Lucien Virot. Such bindings weren't requested out of love, but out of a refusal to let go, or a need to hold power over someone even in death. The hair of the departed would be woven into a pattern so intricate, so impossibly perfect, that it formed a spiritual tether, a chain that prevented the soul from passing peacefully into whatever came next. These were not worn as jewelry. They were hidden, locked away, or worse, destroyed before their power could fully take hold. It is said that some families, plagued by generations of misfortune and shadowed by unseen presences, unknowingly held such bindings within their heirlooms. A ring, a locket, a brooch, long since forgotten. And somewhere, the soul trapped within still waits. So the next time you hold an old piece of mourning jewelry, run your fingers carefully over its patterns. Look closely and ask yourself, what story is it really trying to tell? And more importantly, is it finished? Or is the weave still waiting for its final knot? Grief is a powerful mask. Behind a black veil and a trembling voice, who would dare question the true intentions of the sorrowful, and within that sorrow, sometimes the most terrible crimes lay hidden in plain sight. In the golden age of mourning, jewelry grief was a currency, and for some, it became a perfect alibi. Society viewed the grieving, especially grieving women, as fragile and pure beyond suspicion. To accuse a widow cloaked in black silk, her eyes red with tears of something nefarious, was unthinkable. But as the finest brooches glimmered on black lace collars and delicate rings adorned fingers wrapped in gloves of mourning gray, few realized that some of these tokens didn't just memorialize death. They celebrated murder, the widow's triumph. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb. The year was 1879, and London's high society was abuzz with scandal. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb had married well a wealthy industrialist twice her age, Lord Gregory Whitcomb. It was a union of convenience and power, but beneath the marble halls of their estate, it was whispered that Lord Whitcomb was a cruel man. When he fell ill that spring and died by midsummer society, mourned with Eleanor, admiring her grace and poise. Her mourning attire was the very height of fashion. But what caught everyone's attention was the stunning mourning brooch she wore to his funeral. It was a masterpiece, black onyx, surrounded by seed pearls, and at its center, a miniature portrait framed entirely by the distinct silver hair of the late Lord Whitcomb himself. The brooch became the talk of London. What no one noticed or dared to question was how Lady Eleanor wore that brooch with a hint of satisfaction in her eyes, and how quickly she took control of her late husband's sprawling business empire. Rumors swirled that the Lord's death hadn't been as natural as the doctors claimed. A certain brand of laudanum known to be fatal in high doses was mysteriously missing from the estate's medicine cabinet. But who would accuse the grieving widow, especially one who wore his very memory over her heart? The poisoned pendant, a Parisian scandal. Not all such crimes stayed hidden. In Paris, 1885, the case of Madeleine Artois, a famous opera singer, shocked even the most jaded Parisians. Her wealthy patron and rumored lover, Count Henri Valois, died suddenly during a private performance held in his lavish home. He collapsed mid-toast, a goblet of wine slipping from his grasp. The cause of death, cyanide poisoning. But what truly chilled the public was what surfaced during the investigation. Among Madeleine's many luxurious possessions was a pendant ornate and heavy with gold filigree. It contained a locket of Henri's hair, but hidden behind it, investigators found a compartment filled with traces of cyanide powder. The pendant was not just a keepsake. It had been the very vessel of the Count's undoing. Madeleine was arrested, but until her dying day, she maintained that Henri had poisoned himself, overcome by guilt for betraying his wife. Some believed her. Others claimed she had simply been too clever, hiding her crime behind a curtain of perfectly performed grief. The business of sorrow, criminal enterprises. While high society indulged in the art of mourning, a far more ruthless industry grew in the underbelly of Europe's great cities. In the fog-filled alleys of London's East End groups known as the hair collectors emerged. They supplied hair to meet the unending demand for mourning jewelry. Some obtained it through legitimate means purchased from willing donors desperate for coin, but others were far less scrupulous. Fresh graves were disturbed under the cover of night. Morgue attendants were bribed for locks of hair from the newly deceased. In the darkest cases, vagrants and orphans simply vanished, last seen in the company of shadowy figures offering warm meals and safe shelter. These collectors sold their wares to jewelers who asked no questions. To their clients, the jewelry remained a beautiful reminder of love lost. But the true origins of those strands, unknown, unspoken, forgotten. The ultimate deception. Mourning as murderous theater. Perhaps the most chilling example of crime hidden behind grief was the case of Margareta Dupont, a socialite known for her beauty and unmatched collection of mourning jewelry. She buried 3 husbands before the age of 35. Each death was ruled a tragic accident. Each time she emerged in the most stunning mourning attire Paris had ever seen, gowns of rare black silks from India veils, spun from the finest lace, and always an exquisite piece of hair jewelry created from the locks of her dearly departed. It wasn't until the mysterious death of her 4th fiancé, a wealthy baron, that investigators took a closer look. Hidden inside her dressing room behind a false panel, they discovered a chest filled with vials of poisons, letters of blackmail, and hair. Bundles of it carefully labeled with the names of her lost lovers. It became clear that Margarita had not simply mourned her husbands. She had engineered their deaths, each perfectly timed and concealed behind a facade of delicate sorrow. Before she could be brought to trial, she disappeared without a trace. Some say she fled to South America. Others believe she slipped into a convent under an assumed name. Her jewelry collection scattered through private hands and museum vaults, their dark history long forgotten by those who now admire their craftsmanship. Grief can be honest. Grief can be healing. But history has shown sometimes grief is just a mask. And behind it, the hands that cradle a locket or a mourning brooch may very well be the same hands that caused the death they so elegantly display. Some jewelry was made to be worn with pride, others to be hidden away, locked in drawers and buried under layers of time. And some should never have been crafted at all. For within their delicate weaves and perfect symmetry lay something that couldn't be seen, but was always felt a curse, silent and waiting. It started with whispers. They were never loud, never immediate. But for those who wore certain pieces of mourning jewelry, those crafted with patterns meant not just to remember, but to bind the whispers always came. Late at night when the world had grown still, and the last candle burned low, faint voices stirred in the dark. Sometimes it was a beloved name softly spoken. Other times it was nothing more than a hollow sigh, the kind that raises the hairs on the back of your neck and makes you wonder if you're truly alone. The binding knot, a dangerous art. Few artisans knew how to weave the binding knot. It was a technique older than the grand halls of Victorian England whispered to have originated in the monasteries of the Carpathian Mountains, where monks practiced secret rites to hold restless spirits at bay. The knot wasn't a symbol of remembrance, it was a trap, woven perfectly. It was believed to tether the soul of the deceased to the world of the living. Not out of love, not for comfort, but out of refusal. Refusal to let them go. Refusal to grant them peace. And over time the soul, trapped, restless, and unseen, began to stir. The Broken Widow of Black Hollow. In 1868, the small English village of Black Hollow became infamous for the strange fate of Mrs. Imogen Darrow, a woman known for her grace and deep devotion to her late husband, Captain Nathaniel Darrow. After his death at sea, Imogen was rarely seen without the mourning ring she'd commissioned, crafted entirely from the captain's dark curling hair, woven into the infamous binding knot design. At first, the ring seemed a comfort, but within months, neighbors noticed how pale she had grown, how distant. Her servants spoke of strange footsteps echoing through the house at night, the faint scent of sea salt lingering in her chambers, though she lived miles from the coast. And then came the voices, soft at first, then louder. Her housekeeper swore that on the eve of Imogen's disappearance, she heard the lady weeping. And another voice, rough and cold, whispering just beyond the door, "I never left Imogen, and neither will you. She was never seen again." Her mourning ring was found lying on the pillow of her neatly made bed, the binding knot undone, something said to be impossible once the pattern was sealed. Objects that refused to stay lost. In the archives of the British Museum lies a peculiar case, the Eldridge brooch. Donated anonymously in the early 1900s, the brooch was a masterwork of mourning craftsmanship, jet black onyx encircled by a halo of tightly braided silver hair. The museum curator recorded something strange. Despite being locked away in the archives, the brooch was found moved multiple times, always placed atop unopened storage crates, or resting on the steps leading to the restricted sections of the museum. Staff reported cold spots near where it appeared and an unexplained dampness, as if the air itself wept where the brooch lay. Attempts to track its movements failed. Security measures were tightened, but the phenomenon persisted until the brooch was finally encased in a sealed lead box and buried deep within the restricted archives, along with a warning: do not display, do not wear, do not open. The cursed heirloom of the von Richter family. Perhaps the most chilling tale comes from Germany's aristocratic von Richter family. In the late 1800s, the family patriarch, Count Victor von Richter, died. Under mysterious circumstances, some claimed illness, others whispered suicide. His widow, Lady Greta von Richter, commissioned a mourning necklace from the family's personal artisan, but instead of the typical patterns, she demanded the binding knot. The necklace was a masterpiece, delicate yet strong, woven from the Count's thick black hair, set with a pendant that bore their family crest. From the day she wore it, tragedy struck the von Richter line. Her eldest son fell from a horse and broke his neck. Her youngest drowned under mysterious circumstances, despite being a skilled swimmer. Servants deserted the manor, claiming to see the Count himself, wandering the halls, his eyes black as night. Lady Greta refused to remove the necklace, even as the family's legacy crumbled around her. When she was found dead in her bed, the necklace was gone. No one knows what became of it. Some say it remains hidden in the ruins of the von Richter estate. Others believe it still circulates in private collections, its dark influence continuing through unsuspecting hands. Are these just stories or warnings? Skeptics argue these tales are nothing more than tragic coincidences or the fevered imaginations of grief-stricken hearts. But history leaves behind echoes cold places where warmth should linger faint cries, where only silence should reign. And always there are the objects, rings that go missing only to reappear in strange places, necklaces that seem impossibly cold to the touch, even when left in the sun, and above all the patterns, those ancient weaves that speak of love loss, and something far more dangerous. So if ever you find yourself drawn to a beautiful piece of antique jewelry, take a closer look, trace the patterns with your fingertips, and ask yourself, is it simply art, or is there something, someone, still tied to it, waiting patiently in the silence between each heartbeat? In the hands of a true artist, even death could be made beautiful. And so it was during a time when sorrow hung thick in the air, and loss was a constant companion, that death itself became a canvas and hair, the finest medium through which it was expressed. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as the fear of death intertwined with a growing obsession for remembrance, a strange and haunting form of art emerged: hairwork art. No longer confined to simple lockets or mourning rings, human hair became the primary material for grand and intricate works of artistry. Paintings, wreaths, portraits, and entire framed landscapes were created composed entirely of finely woven and meticulously arranged strands of hair. It was not simply mourning, it was immortality captured in art. The masterpieces of mourning parlors. Across Europe and America, affluent households dedicated entire rooms to these somber masterpieces. These were known as mourning parlors rooms, draped in black lace and heavy velvet curtains, the air thick with the scent of lavender and burning myrrh. Upon the walls hung hairwork wreaths, elaborate circular arrangements made entirely from the hair of deceased family members. Each twist and curl of hair represented a different relative, their lives immortalized not through stone or paint, but through the very fabric of their being. A wreath with light blonde loops might represent a child lost too soon. Dark, tightly coiled strands signified elder family members. Wreaths were often shaped like weeping willows angels or funeral urns, every piece painstakingly detailed and impossibly delicate. Visitors to these homes stood in hushed reverence before these works, their eyes tracing the looping patterns, their hearts heavy with the stories each strand told. The hair portraits of Vienna. In Vienna, a unique form of portraiture took shape in the salons of the elite. Artists began creating full miniature portraits entirely from human hair, arranging strands so fine they mimicked the gentle shading of a painter's brush. From a distance, these portraits seemed like delicate pencil sketches. Up close, the breathtaking reality was revealed. Every line, every shadow was made from hair. One famous example was the portrait of Elise von Braun, a young noblewoman who died at the age of 17. Her grieving father commissioned a life-sized portrait of her composed entirely from her own hair gathered throughout her childhood and adolescence. The portrait hung above the family's hearth for over a century, a hauntingly lifelike reminder of a life cut short. Even today, some claim that standing too close to the portrait on a quiet night, you can catch the faint scent of rosewater, her favorite perfume. Hair flowers, bouquets that never wither. While living blooms, wilted and faded hair flowers offered a strange and permanent alternative. Artisans would craft entire bouquets from intricately curled and lacquered strands of hair, forming roses, lilies, forget-me-nots, and violets. These bouquets were displayed under glass domes, preserved perfectly for generations. In some cultures, these hair flowers were used as wedding gifts, combining the hair of both bride and groom as a symbol of eternal union. But more often, they were created in the wake of death, a final everlasting bouquet from those left behind. It was not uncommon for young women to be taught this art form as part of their domestic education, ensuring that every household had the means to memorialize their loved ones properly when the inevitable came. The Parisian Salon of Eternal Remembrance. Perhaps the most famous exhibition of this macabre art form was held in Paris, 1892, at the Grand Salon de la Mémoire Éternelle, the Salon of Eternal Memory. Patrons walked through shadowed halls lined with hair wreaths the size of carriage wheels, portraits that seemed to breathe with uncanny life, and towering centerpieces depicting entire biblical scenes rendered in nothing but human hair. At the center of the exhibition stood the infamous Tree of Ancestors, a 10-foot-tall sculpture crafted entirely from the hair of over 300 individuals representing 5 generations of a single aristocratic family. Its branches spread wide and solemn, each leaf a tiny, perfect braid of hair. It was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. Visitors wept openly at the beauty and horror of it, unable to look away, unable to forget. When art became obsession, but as with all things touched by death, obsession often followed. Some collectors went to extreme lengths to acquire rare hair colors and textures. The blackest black hair was highly coveted, believed to be almost impossible to find naturally. Fiery red strands were considered powerful symbolic of untamed passion and violent ends. Albinistic white hair, ethereal and ghost-like, became a symbol of purity and was used in the most exclusive commissions. And where there is demand, there is always someone willing to supply. It is said that unscrupulous traders scoured orphanages, asylums, and even graveyards to obtain hair for profit. Some paid desperate families for locks of hair from their living children. Others took without asking. Entire shipments of human hair were smuggled across borders, traded like the most exotic of spices or rarest of gems. The decline of a morbid beauty. By the dawn of the 20th century, the fashion of mourning art began to fade. The modern world moved too quickly, its eyes set on the future, rather than lingering in the shadows of the past. Science replaced superstition. Medicine conquered many of the diseases that once filled homes with sorrow. And with these changes, the rituals surrounding death softened, became more private, less adorned. Yet the art remained, tucked away in forgotten attics, displayed quietly in provincial museums, or hidden behind glass in the homes of those who could not bear to part with the past. The intricate weaves remain untouched by time. The curls and braids, unchanged through centuries, continue to hold their silent vigil. And perhaps in those silent rooms and behind locked cabinet doors, death still waits. Not as a terror, not as a tragedy, but as a work of art, eternal, patient, and impossibly beautiful. All things, no matter how beautiful or beloved, eventually fade. And so it was that the grand era of mourning jewelry and death art, once the height of fashion and a monument to eternal remembrance, began to wither, just like the very lives it was meant to honor. By the late 19th century, a quiet shift began to ripple through the gilded parlors and shadowed mourning rooms of Europe and America. The world was changing. Cities grew taller. Streets buzzed with the sound of engines rather than horse hooves. Science and reason began to eclipse superstition. And with the advances in medicine, hygiene, and public health, the looming specter of death that had hung over every family for centuries slowly began to lift. Where death had once been an everyday presence, an expected visitor in the homes of both rich and poor, it now became something to be managed, hidden away in hospitals and behind closed doors. And with its retreat, the elaborate displays of grief that had defined the Victorian era lost their place. The rise of the new century, a future without shadows. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it an entirely new philosophy toward life and death. The younger generation no longer wished to be bound by the heavy mourning traditions of their parents and grandparents. Black crepe dresses, thick veils, and entire wardrobes dedicated to mourning were seen as old-fashioned and oppressive. Industrial progress promised a brighter, cleaner, healthier future. Optimism filled the air. People no longer wished to dwell in the past. They wanted to live, boldly embrace the modern world, and leave behind the morbid rituals that had weighed them down. Fashion reflected this change. Mourning clothes became simpler, their rigid rules relaxed. Jewelry shifted from the somber blacks of jet and onyx to the brilliant sparkle of diamonds and light, airy designs. And most telling of all, the demand for hair jewelry collapsed almost overnight. What had once been the most intimate and treasured form of remembrance now seemed grotesque. The Great Wars, when grief became too large to bear, and then, as if to seal the end of an era, the world was thrust into the chaos of the First World War. Death no longer visited quietly through illness or old age. It arrived in thunderous explosions in the trenches, in the gas-filled battlefields. Entire generations of young men were lost in a span of months. Their bodies never recovered. Their graves scattered across foreign soil. In the face of such overwhelming and senseless loss, the old rituals felt inadequate. What good was a lock of hair when a mother had lost all her sons? What comfort could a mourning ring bring when widows numbered in the thousands? Grief became too vast, too public, and far too painful to be reduced to the delicate confines of a locket or a woven bracelet. The world, it seemed, could no longer afford the luxury of private sorrow. From mourning to memorialization, the focus of remembrance shifted from personal keepsakes to public monuments. Stone cenotaphs rose in city centers. Memorial parks and eternal flames burned in honor of the unnamed dead. Names were etched into vast walls, recorded for eternity where all could see. Grief became a collective experience, and the intimate tactile art of mourning jewelry faded into history. Even Queen Victoria's death in 1901 marked a final symbolic end to the era she had so profoundly shaped. Without her as the emblem of eternal mourning, the fashion lost its queen. What happened to the jewelry? As mourning customs disappeared, families faced a difficult choice. What does one do with a brooch made from a mother's hair? A necklace containing the woven strands of a child long lost. Some were tucked away in velvet-lined drawers, too precious or painful to discard. Others were quietly sold to antique dealers or melted down for the value of their metals and gemstones, leaving the carefully woven hair to be discarded, unceremoniously burned or buried. Museums acquired the most intricate and famous pieces, placing them behind glass, their stories reduced to small plaques and silent displays. The delicate artistry of grief became a curiosity, something to be observed, but no longer felt. A whisper that never fully faded. Yet, like all things connected to death, the story didn't end completely. Even today, in forgotten attics and dust-covered trunks, mourning jewelry lies, hidden silent remnants of a time when love and loss were bound together by delicate strands of human hair. Occasionally, a piece will surface at an auction house, its provenance lost, but its craftsmanship undeniable. Collectors, historians, and those drawn to the melancholy beauty of the past still seek them out, each piece a tiny, haunting testament to the fragility of life and the desperate human need to hold on, even when letting go is the only way forward. And so the fashion of death faded, not with a final grand farewell, but with a quiet sigh, a slow death, not unlike the fading breath of those it once honored. Behind polished glass and under soft museum lights, the last whispers of this forgotten art remain. But these are more than just artifacts. They are silent witnesses to grief, love, and obsession, captured forever in delicate braids and loops of human hair. Today, most who wander the hushed halls of historical museums and curiosity collections walk right past these fragile remnants without a second glance. They stop to admire oil paintings, glittering crowns, and the heavy ironworks of old weaponry. But few notice the small, darkened display cases tucked into the corners of decorative arts, exhibits labeled simply as mourning jewelry or sentimental keepsakes. And yet within those modest cases lies a legacy unlike any other, a haunting testament to humanity's desperate need to remember and to never let go. The Victoria and Albert Museum, London's Cabinet of Sorrows, perhaps the most famous collection of mourning jewelry, is found within the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Among its countless treasures there sits a glass case filled with objects that at first glance seem quaint, delicate rings, brooches, and pendants. But look closer and the truth reveals itself. Behind the faded gold and black enamel are finely braided strands of hair, some formed into perfect circles, others shaped into tiny wreaths or intricate monograms. One of the most chilling artifacts is a mourning ring belonging to Queen Victoria herself, containing a lock of Prince Albert's hair. It is said that she wore this ring daily for the remaining 40 years of her life, a constant silent companion to her endless grief. Visitors stand before the display, their breath fogging the glass, imagining the weight of such sorrow carried on a single finger. The Museum of Mourning Art, Pennsylvania, USA. Across the Atlantic, tucked away in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania, sits the Museum of Mourning Art, a small, specialized collection dedicated entirely to the traditions of death and remembrance. Here the displays are more intimate, more focused. Framed hair wreaths nearly 3 feet in diameter hang solemnly on the walls. Lockets containing impossibly small floral arrangements made entirely from hair rest under soft spotlights. A rare mourning sampler, a teaching tool from the 1800s, shows young women learning to weave hair into different memorial patterns, a domestic skill once as important as embroidery or cooking. Some visitors report a strange feeling when they pass through these rooms. A chill in the air, a faint scent of old lavender and faded perfume, and always the feeling of being watched. Private collections, hidden histories. Not all of these legacies remain behind museum glass. Some of the most exquisite and unsettling pieces of mourning jewelry and hair art are held in private collections, hidden away from public view. Collectors, often fascinated by the macabre or driven by a desire to preserve forgotten art forms, have gathered these relics across decades. One such collector, a British historian named Eleanor Haddington, owns a locket said to contain not only the hair of the deceased, but a tiny, handwritten final confession folded behind it. The note is sealed, its contents never revealed. Miss Haddington claims that opening it would break the pact made by its original owner. She keeps it locked away in a velvet-lined box, brought out only under candlelight for rare whispered viewings. Mysteries sealed in time. Despite careful curation, many of these objects remain shrouded in mystery. Their creators long forgotten the identities of the lost souls whose hair was so carefully preserved, often lost to time. Who were they? What lives did they lead? What stories do these silent strands still try to tell? Some items carry cryptic inscriptions, initials, dates, or phrases like "in everlasting memory," but no other clues. Others contain patterns that baffle modern historians, their weaves suggesting messages and meanings from a long-forgotten symbolic language. In certain circles, there is a belief that some of these pieces still hold spiritual ties, that the hair within them remains a connection between the living and the dead, a thread of energy never truly severed. Are these artifacts, or prisoners? One cannot help but wonder, are these relics of a grieving past merely historical curiosities? Or do they still hold something more? A presence? A whisper? A faint longing carried across centuries? When the last light dims in the museum halls and the footsteps of visitors fade, do these forgotten memories stir? Does the faint scent of rosewater or lavender linger just a moment longer than it should? Do the intricate knots and braids within these rings and brooches quietly remember the hands that once held them close to a grieving heart? And so they remain locked safely away behind barriers of glass and polite curiosity. A legacy not entirely dead, not entirely alive, just waiting. Sometimes it isn't the spoken words that haunt us, it's the words left unsaid, the letters never sent, the confessions never read. And in the forgotten corners of attics and locked drawers, these silent voices remain sealed in faded envelopes and wrapped in strands of memory. It was a stormy evening when Evelyn Mercer, a historian specializing in mourning customs, received a curious call from an elderly client. "I think I've found something you should see," the voice crackled over the line. "In my grandmother's attic, hidden behind the old rafters. It's a box. I haven't dared to open it." By morning, Evelyn stood in a crumbling estate on the outskirts of Bath, her hands running across the cold iron clasp of a small wooden chest, no larger than a jewelry box. It was beautifully crafted, carved with ivy patterns, the symbol of eternal life, and sealed with a delicate silver lock shaped like a weeping angel. Beside the box sat a faded black ribbon and a brittle envelope yellowed by time. On its surface, written in elegant trembling script, were the words, "For when the heart is finally ready." But the seal was unbroken. The weight of unspoken words. Evelyn hesitated. There was a sacredness to letters left unopened, a silent agreement between the past and the present. Some things were meant to remain unsaid, their truths buried along with those who had carried them. And yet, what if this was a final goodbye never given? With gloved fingers, she carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the fragile parchment. The handwriting was shaky, but still legible. "My dearest Henry, I wonder, when you hold this letter in your hands, will I still linger near you? Or will my absence feel as cold and final as I fear? They have told me I have little time. The doctors' faces grow longer each day, their words softer, their eyes avoiding mine. But it isn't death I fear, Henry. It's being forgotten. It's knowing that you may carry on without ever knowing the truth of what was hidden in my heart. Forgive me, my love. I was never brave enough to say these things aloud. But know that every time you touched the locket at my throat, you touched more than a simple keepsake. You touched a promise and a secret. Inside that locket, hidden beneath the braid of my mother's hair, lies a single strand of yours, taken the night we danced beneath the gas lamps in Regent's Park, the night I knew my heart belonged to you forever. If you are reading this, perhaps it's time to open the locket and know the fullness of my love at last. Yours in life and in death, Amelia. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. The air in the attic felt heavier, as if the weight of a century's grief hung thick around her shoulders. She turned back to the chest and, with a soft click, opened it. Inside was a single item, a small gold locket, its surface worn smooth, From years of being held, touched, perhaps kissed in lonely moments of longing. With great care, she opened it. Just as the letter described, beneath a perfectly preserved braid of pale golden hair, tucked behind the faded silk lining, was a single dark strand, black as a raven's wing, a stark contrast against the blonde, a silent testament to a love unspoken. The power of a simple thread. That one hidden strand told a story no history book could capture, of a love forbidden, or perhaps left unrealized, of a woman too bound by societal expectations or family duty to live the life she truly wanted, of a man who perhaps never knew the depth of the affection held for him until long after it was too late. It was a reminder that mourning jewelry had never been just about death. It was about life, the moments stolen, the words left unsaid, the quiet touches that meant more than 1,000 spoken vows. The locket's final journey. Evelyn took the locket and the letter to the local archives, where both were preserved, documented not as relics of a historical figure, but as the final testament of a life lived quietly, deeply, and ultimately alone. She often wondered what became of Henry. Did he ever open this letter? Did he live his life never knowing that even in her final moments, Amelia's greatest sorrow was not her impending death, but the fear that she had left her heart's greatest truth unspoken? And what of us? How many of us, Evelyn thought, carry our own unread letters? How many unspoken words lie buried in the attics of our hearts, tucked away behind pride, fear, or regret? In the end, perhaps that is the greatest tragedy, not the loss of life itself, but the loss of connection. The final words that could have healed, the simple admissions that might have changed everything, left forever unread. So if by chance you find an old letter sealed tight in the forgotten corners of your home, ask yourself who left it there. And more importantly, are you ready to read it? In every silent hallway, in every locked drawer and forgotten attic, history lingers. Not in the grand monuments or polished marble statues, but in the fragile, delicate things left behind. In a single lock of hair, a faded letter, a ring too small for modern fingers, but heavy with the weight of untold stories. We often imagine history as something loud, marked by wars, revolutions, and roaring crowds. But some of the most powerful echoes of the past are barely whispers. They live in the quiet grief of a mother, braiding the hair of a lost child into a mourning wreath. In the trembling hands of a widow, fastening a locket over her heart, a final promise sealed inside. In the flicker of candlelight reflecting off a tiny ring, spun not from gold, but from the enduring strands of the departed. And though the fashion of mourning has long since faded, the need to remember remains. Centuries have passed, the grand rituals are gone, but the human heart still clings to tokens of memory. We wear a loved one's ring long after they're gone. We keep their favorite scarf tucked in a drawer, their old letters folded between the pages of books. We carry photos in our wallets, preserve voicemails we cannot bear to delete, and whisper their names into the quiet when no one else is listening. It seems we have always feared the same thing, not just death itself, but the final forgetting. And perhaps that's why mourning jewelry, though strange and morbid to modern eyes, still moves us when we see it. Because in every delicate braid, in every faded locket, and carefully woven ring, there is a message. I was here, I was loved, and even in death, I remain. Maybe that is all any of us truly want. not to be immortal, but to be remembered. So as you step away from this story and return to the noise and color of modern life, I leave you with one simple question. Who will carry your memory, and what small thing might you leave behind? Not in wealth or grandeur, but in love, a note, a whispered story, a keepsake tucked carefully into the hands of someone who will remember. Because even as the echoes of history fade, even as the old traditions fall silent, a single thread of remembrance is enough to tie us forever to those we leave behind. And in the end, perhaps that's the most beautiful legacy of all. Some legacies are carved in stone, but the most enduring are held in the quiet corners of a heart. What thread of memory will you leave behind? Share your story below, because even the smallest remembrance can echo through time. Leave a comment sharing the memory of someone you'll never forget. And if this story moved, you don't forget to like and subscribe to help us keep their echoes alive.